Very well. Hello and welcome at the next press conference of today here at the World Economic Forum on ASEAN here in Hanoi, Vietnam. This is perhaps, let's see if it materializes, but this is perhaps the most exciting topic to be talking about, or at least the most important question to be answered, which is what will be the impact of artificial intelligence on jobs in the future. It's a setup we've already seen, of course, this morning and yesterday, talking about the fourth industrial revolution, which is hitting ASEAN and, of course, the whole world. And it's the first time with this study that we're going to be talking about today that we actually are quantifying what will be the impact of AI, which jobs will be disappearing, and which other jobs will be appearing, and what is the skills transition that is needed to come out on the winning hand, so to speak. So we'll be looking today at that study, a study prepared by Cisco. And here to talk about that are two of Cisco's managers. The first is Naveen Menon, who is the president of Cisco in ASEAN, and also an author, or the author of the report that we'll look at. And then also with us is Thuy Luong. And Thuy is from Vietnam, or is at least the country manager and general director for Cisco in Vietnam. And she'll be able to comment on the impact for Vietnam. But before we get into the details for Vietnam, why don't we ask Naveen to kick it off with the main insights of this exciting study. Go ahead.
Okay. So thank you very much, distinguished members of the press. Thank you for being here and to cover this story. So we have taken a position on the impact that automation and AI will have on jobs. There are many studies in the world that say that AI will impact jobs, but very few studies actually tell you how much the impact will be, which jobs will be impacted, which countries will be more impacted than others, which skills are needed in the future, and which industries will be transformed, and how will the labor market look like by 2028. So let me just tell you about the context. So in ASEAN, there are 630 million people, 50% aged under 30 years old. 90% of those under 30 have access to the internet. The digital economy can add $1 trillion worth of GDP by 2025. There is continued growth expected. Adoption of technology is picking up. Innovation is gathering pace. We're seeing largest advancements in the artificial intelligence front, and AI-enabled technologies will open up new growth areas. However, the increased adoption of technologies coupled with advances in the use of AI through software, hardware, and robotics will help to lower cost of goods and services. It will drive a demand and will boost growth. It will also create millions of jobs. So we have seen that when we look into the creation of jobs, we see that there are going to be some sectors that will see an increase in the job market. So the wholesale and retail industries will see about 1.8 million jobs created. The manufacturing industries in ASEAN will see 0.9 million, close to 1 million jobs created. The construction industry will see about 1 million jobs created. We also see jobs will be created, about 400,000 jobs created in hotels and restaurants, 200,000 jobs in finance and insurance sector, and we see almost 200,000 jobs created in public administration. And the IT industries, health industries, professional services will also be impacted positively. However, the AI-enabled technologies will also see a marked shift in the labor model. So the labor market will change shape. What that means is that many skills that we have now will be redundant. We also will see, unfortunately, the lowest skilled workers will be the most at risk. And the sectors that are most vulnerable to the impact of AI are in the services and the agricultural industries. So in total, we expect about 28 million jobs fewer will be needed in order to fulfill the same economic output as today. So let me just say that again. In order to keep the same economic output, we can deliver the same economic output by 2028, but with 28 million fewer jobs. The jobs that are going to be impacted, we've mapped by country. So the largest displacement of jobs on a percentage basis will come from Singapore. 21% of the labor force will be displaced. That equates to only 500,000 jobs, 500,000 jobs. Indonesia, on the other hand, will see about 9.5 million jobs impacted. That is only 8% of the labor force, but that is the largest number of jobs that will be impacted in ASEAN. Malaysia, we expect, will see about 1.2 million jobs impacted. That's 7.4% of the jobs in total. The Philippines will see about 4.5 million jobs displaced. That's 10% of the workforce. Thailand will see 4.9 million jobs impacted. That is 11.9 or 12% of the workforce. And Vietnam will see 13.8% of all the jobs displaced. And that is 7.5 million workers in Vietnam. So in total, that adds up to 10.2% of the overall labor market. That is 28 million jobs in total. So of the 28 million jobs, 6.6 million of those jobs will require reskilling. So that means 21 million jobs will not require dramatic reskilling. They will basically, you may be operating in the retail industry or in the trucking industry, and you may continue to see your job in that industry. However, 6.6 million of those 28 million jobs will either require a shift in the occupation that you're doing, a shift in the task that you're actually doing, the task profile, or a shift in industry, or a shift in the country. So if you're working in the Philippines, you may need to move to Vietnam, or if you're working in mining, you may need to move to retail. There's a lot of shifts, and 6.6 million of those workers will need reskilling. That requires new skills like problem solving, design thinking, leadership and collaboration, conflict resolution, empathy. And these skills will enable workers to be flexible. And that is what we're urging all countries to do, is to develop a flexible labor force, a flexible labor force. So how do you do that? Through formal training and education, commitment to on-the-job training, policy changes needed by the government to make it easier for citizens to reskill and retrain their workforce. Businesses will need to preempt this and retrain their staff, preparing them for what's coming ahead. And educational institutions will need to change the way they deliver curriculum in the future. So those are the key elements of the study. They're highlighted in the press release that we will be issuing out. And then the full study is in this document. Let me just highlight just in closing, how detailed this study is, okay? We studied 6 countries. We studied 21 industries, 430 occupations, and 41 work tasks. So you can imagine it's a complex model. We evaluated this model over a 10-year period. We ran this model in consultation with about 10 to 15 experts that come from public sector, private sector, non-profit, academics, and civil society. So it was a comprehensive exercise. It's probably the first time you're seeing a forecast of the labor model in this way. So I'm very happy to take any questions. That's probably just what I wanted to cover at this stage.
Absolutely, and I have to say, very impressive work. And I would say I have to look for words because it's also mind-blowing and perhaps also terrifying. It's, of course, in order to address a problem, you have to first know the problem. And it seems like that this is sort of the first time that we are getting to know the problem. I just want to clarify before we move on to questions and also let Thuy weigh in. You talked about sort of the positive impact first. And if I add those numbers up, I get to around 4.5 million, or around that number in terms of new jobs created. And then you talked about 28 million jobs that were needed fewer if we're going to create the same economic output. Of course, the hope is that in 10 years' time, the economic output of the region will be much greater. And then finally, you talked about the jobs that are going to need reskilling. So I suppose that it will continue to exist, but that requires considerable reskilling. The net impact, however, it seems to be negative. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct. Although it's a fair assumption from what you said. We chose consciously to avoid a situation to estimate whether there would be net new jobs created or net jobs lost. And I'll tell you why. Because the history has shown, when you go back hundreds and hundreds of years, that every single forecast we have on the impact of technology on jobs has been wrong.
Sure.
So what we've done is we have constructed a labor market model. The labor market model is predicated on the fact that we will only have a certain level of economic output, and that stays the same. So we looked at the total economic output and we said that will stay, let's say that stays the same. How much labor do you need to produce that level of economic output? Once we had that, we can see that the workers that typically are displaced, they typically are showing up in other parts of the labor market because they need to get new jobs, right? There's something called the income effect in economic theory, which is when you make productivity savings, you reinvest that back into projects that generates new income. The new income generates new jobs. Okay? So the net effect in our model is zero, right? That is our assumption because we didn't want to say 1 trillion jobs will be created, 1 billion jobs, 200 million jobs. You know, it doesn't make sense.
Sure.
Because whatever you put out there would be wrong. But what we wanted to know, and this is the most important part of the study, what we wanted to know is if these jobs move from A to B, how do we train the workers? Because that is the key question. It's not about whether there are more jobs or less. It's about how do we make sure we create a flexible labor market model so that workers can move to new jobs, even when they're in mid-career. Like in my case, if I wanted to move to another job, I should be able to. We're living longer, we're working longer. We should be able to move from one job to the other. So the flexible labor model is what we're after, and what reskilling governments and private sector needs to do to enable that flexible labor model.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that clarification, Naveen. And of course, we are here in Vietnam, and so I want to ask Thuy, you know, from the perspective of Vietnam and the labor market that it has right now, when you look at manufacturing, for example, right now, actually, experts would say Vietnam is sort of already, if you want to go to Vietnam now, it's too late. All the good workers and all the good manufacturing places are taken. In other words, it seems to be quite okay right now in terms of where Vietnam is in terms of employment. Now, of course, as Naveen said, going forward, we'll see quite considerable displacement. We'll see reskilling is needed, and we'll see new jobs, but also new skills that are needed for those new jobs. Where would you recommend, if you were a policymaker or a business in Vietnam, where would you recommend to focus efforts in order to make the most out of this sort of effect of artificial intelligence?
Yeah. You know, actually, what Naveen sharing about the impact from the AI trends and the impact of job impacts. So for Vietnam, I think Vietnam is not the exception. Vietnam is not the exception. The transformation, you say, is no longer a vision now in Vietnam. So it has become the reality. So from the web, right, from what the Vietnam Prime Minister is sharing, it is a very strong message from him about the digital transformation. And all of the business across Vietnam is now adopting technologies in order to overcome challenges and in order to open new opportunities in Vietnam. So what I can see is people, the investor, the foreign investor, they come to Vietnam. Vietnam is still considered a very attractive destination to Vietnam. And one of the reasons is we have the low-cost labor, right? But the challenge from Vietnam is the low-skill force is the majority, and we lack of the high quality and skilled workforce. So that is the challenge. So the advantage of Vietnam nowadays, maybe in the next 5 years or in the next 10 years, is no longer the advantage. So I think, based on the report here, so I can see in the next 10 years, 1.8 million existing roles will disappear from the Vietnam market. So, and based on the job display and the job created in the next 10 years in Vietnam, we can see that the job display is more than the job that the government, the market is created. So it is a really big challenge from Vietnam. So then I think the government, they need to have some solutions. So otherwise it will be the big challenge for the society.
Yeah. Thank you, Thuy, for weighing in. And I think there's going to be quite a few questions also from the audience. So I want to give the opportunity now for people in the audience to ask their questions. We've got a microphone over there, and I already see 2 questions. So we'll start with the gentleman over here and then turn to the lady over there. If you will identify yourself and then ask your question.
Good afternoon. I'm from Cambodia. My name is Mohan. The figures you mentioned are shocking. In 10 years, 28 million people will be out of jobs compared to 4.5 million jobs created. What is the basis for you to come to that 28 million jobs displacement figure? And in terms of percentage, it looks small, 2%, 4%, 5%. But in terms of real numbers, it is shocking, 500,000 in Singapore, 1 million plus in Indonesia. So what is the basis for these figures? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
So just to clarify, this is an important point, the jobs displaced and the jobs created in this study are equal. So I'm not saying there will be 28 million jobs less in the future. What I'm saying is that 28 million jobs will move. So jobs that we're currently doing right now may no longer be needed. They will move to other parts of the labor market where 28 million additional jobs will be created. Okay? We're assuming a net zero impact on the labor force because that's the way the model is constructed. It's a labor market model. It's showing where the work is right now and where the work will be in the future. Whether there is redundancies or whether there are layoffs or whether there are people put out of work is a matter for individual companies and for governments to decide for themselves, because they may choose to put in place regulation to protect those workers, for example. But we have assumed that those jobs that are displaced are recreated somewhere else in the whole ecosystem. So it's not 28 million and 4.5. It's 28 million will be displaced, meaning they will move from one place to another. So the question that you asked is, how did you come up with that number? So what we did is we did a sort of a 5-step process. Okay, the first step we did is we evaluated the technology landscape. In the technology landscape, we looked at 15 key megatrends affecting AI, or typically along the lines of AI, right? We then assembled a task force of experts around the world, and we invited them in to look at these 15 trends and paint a picture of how these technology will be actually implemented in their country by 2028. The third step we did is when we saw the impact of that technology by 2028, we calculated the productivity gains that would come from the impact of those technologies. And this is data that's well existing in the US and in other parts of the world. we used economic proxies to figure out what the productivity savings would be. We then calculated the income effect, which means when you save money, you reinvest it, and new jobs are created. So we then modeled the income effect on those 6 countries, 21 industries, 430 occupations, and 41 task types. And then finally, we constructed the skills shortage. So in the report, you'll see jobs will be displaced, jobs will be created. There is a skills shortage. So we looked at which jobs typically can move to other jobs. So there may be some jobs, like for example, you may start your career as an administrative clerk. You may move into tourism, and then move into retail, and then move into potentially into government administration. We have a model which shows which jobs can move into which jobs and which jobs typically cannot be translated into. So for example, it's very unheard of for someone to start their career in, say, public administration and finish their career as a surgeon or a medical doctor. Some jobs just don't work that way. So we applied that into the model, and we looked at, okay, where is the skills shortage? And the shocking thing about the skills shortage, and you'll see this in the report, is that there are massive skills shortages in IT skills. So of the 6.6 million jobs that are displaced, 41% of those workers lack IT skills. They are acutely lacking. We also noted that 30% of those workers in the 6.6 million that are displaced lack interactive skills that will be demanded by future vacancies. So what I mean by interactive is we will be expecting to do a lot more interaction in the future. Now, what I mean by interaction is a lot more intense physical interaction with another human body, but also a lot more interaction with a machine. So, for example, when you drive a car today, you are interacting a lot more with the machine because you have all these meter readings that come up and pop up. In the future, there'll be many, many more instances across the labor force where you'll have to interact with machines. And we found that 30% of those people that are impacted or will be displaced lack interactive skills like negotiation, persuasion, customer service skills. And 25% of that labor force lack foundational skills like active learning, reading, writing. Hence, there's a lot of work we need to do to invest in that skills development. Hopefully that answers your question.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I had a second question over here from the front.
Hi there. I'm Jenny Vaughn with AFP News Agency. When you talk about shifting jobs from A to B, that obviously relies on a number of factors, education, for example, other things you talked about. Which countries are not in a position to successfully transfer those jobs? I'm thinking of lower income countries in the region. And what's at stake if that transfer doesn't happen in terms of economic growth?
Thank you.
Okay, so the study is a pure econometric study. It doesn't comment on countries' willingness or ability to transform themselves to the new labor market. But what I can say is that the largest impact by country is going to be in Indonesia, right? That is where the largest amount of displacement occurs. So you'll see that in the report. It's on page 13 that 9.5 million workers in Indonesia will be displaced. The second largest impact would come in Vietnam at 7.5 million workers. The third in Thailand at 4.9 million workers. The fourth in the Philippines at 4.5 million workers. And then Malaysia at 1.2 million and Singapore at 0.5. The largest displacement in percentage terms will be in Singapore. And the reason why that is because the adoption of technology in an island state like Singapore will progress at a lot faster rate. Hence, the nature of work will change. So that's kind of the way the model works. Now, I can't comment on which country is more or less likely because it's an econometric study. It's not a policy study.
Can you provide comments just in terms of what's at stake if that job transfer doesn't occur?
Just with the microphone.
Oh, sorry. If you can just provide some comment on what's at stake if the job transfer doesn't occur in the region as a whole or in some of these these countries that will be impacted.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot at stake because, firstly, there is a race towards for innovation. There's a race for productivity. There's a race to come up with, the best, most talented workers. There's a race to actually hire the most talented workers. So if those job transitions don't happen, the labor market tends to flow to where labor demand is needed, right? So the supply moves to where the demand is. Now that demand could be outside of ASEAN, which would be a shame because we have a lot of talented people in ASEAN, but they may move out of ASEAN if that labor market is not fulfilled. Hence, that would impact productivity, and that would impact innovation, that would impact growth. So we have to fulfill the requirement.
Very well, thank you. And I think we have time for one more question, if there is one from the audience. Let's have a look. It's in any case a fascinating study, Naveen, and I'm sure we'll be hearing more from it going forward.
You can tell me in 10 years' time if we were wrong. All right.
So as you said, it seemed like very often, or almost always, as you indicated, those studies in terms of the specific numbers are wrong. But what's important is that somebody actually takes a stab at it and sort of quantifies it. Because if you have no clue whatsoever about what the impact will be, and more importantly, which sectors and which skills are needed going forward, exactly. You really can't start to answer the challenge, so to speak.
On the skills, on the reskilling, the retraining, etc. Absolutely, yeah. That's
the
purpose.
And what you said earlier, when you talked about the displacement, and then it sort of hit me. Basically, it's not per se a problem if the displacement is biggest, like in Singapore, as long as on the mirror image of that, the country is able to cope with it,
yeah.
And sort of is at the forefront of this fourth industrial revolution. Actually, it can be a great advantage if you're able to cope with much more displacement because you'll be able to really take the lead in AI.
Absolutely, and to the point earlier about which country and this displacement, one thing we don't comment on, which I have a hypothesis on, but we don't comment on in the paper, is when these jobs move, will the jobs be more interesting?
Right.
I generally believe, yes, they will be more interesting because we will have a lot more aided machines to help us with our work. So it makes our life a lot more interesting. So I'm hopeful that not only will we be able to fill those jobs, but we will also move into jobs that are a lot more interesting for us to be part of. Because as we know, jobs, the more you work, the longer you live and the more productive you are. Because if we all just stopped working, actually our life expectancy would go down. We need to work as humans to keep being useful in society. And that has a direct longevity correlation. So I'm hoping that the jobs are more interesting. I'm hoping that we'll live longer and it'll all be a lot better. So actually we feel quite positive that this is sending us in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. I want to thank you and also Thuy, of course, for a very interesting press conference and presentation of the study. I think the study is available now, and you will be able to get it from the colleagues of Cisco who've prepared it. And otherwise, I want to thank you all for being here again today, also in the audience and back at home. Thank you.